Well, good evening, everyone, and welcome to the first Inland Empire Antiracist Summit that is powered by the Inland Empire Black Equity Initiative. I am Corey Jackson, CEO of SBX Youth and Family Services, and serve as co-director of the Center Against Racism and Trauma, also known as CART. Our mission is to equip the Inland Empire with the information and opportunities to fight against all forms of racism. CART is designed to push dignity and humanity forward. But none of this would have been possible without our sponsors. Our sponsors are SBX Youth and Family Services, IEHP, the Riverside NAACP, the Inland Empire Community Foundation, Parkview Legacy Foundation, the Center for Community Action and Environmental Justice, and the Southern California News Group. Many of you found out about this through either a sponsor or one of our great co-hosts for this event. Our co-host includes the Congregations Organized for Prophetic Engagement, also known as COPE, the Blue Education Foundation, Reach Out, Young Visionaries Youth Academy, Time for Change Foundation, the UCR Center for Social Innovation, the Youth Action Project, Sahaba Initiative, as well as Anti-Racist Riverside and the Youth Mentoring Action Network. We want to thank all of them for their participation. If there are people who are not able to participate in this event through Zoom, it's important to also know that they can go to Facebook Live, where it is up right now as well, as soon as we hit our capacity. So please go there, and we'll also put the link in the chat if any of them ask. So Jessica, if you can put that link in the chat, that'll be great. It's also will be posted in 48 hours on CART's YouTube page as well. We ask that all attendees really be respectful in their questions and their comments. If we become aware of any inappropriate comments, then we will unfortunately have to remove you from this event. We're asking everyone to stay muted, and if you would like to ask any questions, please type your questions in the Q&A box, not the chat box, the Q&A box, so that we'll be able to make sure your questions are asked. If you try to put questions in the chat box, unfortunately, we won't be looking there. So please put it in the Q&A. So tonight, it's important to know that we declare that the Inland Empire is a no-hate zone, and we will not accept racism as a part of our culture, our institutions, and our policies. It is our hope that you are here because you are an anti-racist or would like to become one, which means you are committing yourself to actively destroy racism in the region we all call home. This would not be an anti-racist summit if action was not involved in it. So we are going to practice being an anti-racist right now, because many of us woke up seeing the hate crimes being committed To our Asian American and Pacific Islander brothers and sisters, they are under attack all over this country. We saw the attack last night in which 8 people were killed, 6 of them Asian American or Pacific Islander. And yes, it is happening right here in this state of California. And we are saying that this will not, cannot, should not happen here in the Inland Empire. We collectively say that this is not acceptable and it must stop now. Now, to help us fight against these hate crimes, we're asking everyone to go to our website, and we will bring it up now at destroyracism.org. Go to destroyracism.org, and we will put it in the chat as well. Jessica, if you can help with that as well. And what you will see when you go to the website at destroyracism.org, same place where you registered for your event to be here tonight, and you go to the blog section. And when you go to the blog section, what you will see is our first anti-racist advisory that speaks about the Asian American Pacific Islander issue in which hate crimes are happening. You click that blog, and when you click the blog, it'll take you. You'll see what the issue is, right? Understanding that because of the coronavirus, what we have seen are people taking advantage of it for political reasons. We've heard people call it the China virus and the Kung flu. All of these things are meant to blame the coronavirus on a group of people. And we're saying that it is nobody's fault. And if you scroll down, you'll see what you can do about it. And what we need you to do about it is we need you to use your social media to speak out about this. We need you to defend members of the Asian American and Pacific Islander community. When you see them being harassed or targeted in the public or online, we have to educate other people. And what we have to make sure people know is that Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders should not be feared. They cannot spread this virus more than anybody else. And that this community is an honorable and important part of our community and our society. And their culture and values make us stronger as a community. We have to do better. So we're asking everyone to please go to the links below and share it on your Facebook page, your Twitter page, and you can also your any other forms of media that you can share it. So we ask everybody to go there right now and share it. And when you have finished sharing it, put in the chat that you're done, that you've completed it. Just put in the chat done, that you have shared this advisory to the public. We have to speak out about it. Silence is not an option. When we are silent, we become part of the problem. I'm starting to see some dones in the chat. Keep doing it. Keep doing it. Shared or done, however you want to do it, but please make sure that you do so. We have got to share this throughout our community here in the Inland Empire. So it is not enough to say that you're not a racist. It is not enough to feel bad that this disgusting crimes are happening. We must speak up and do something about it. And while you're on the website, we're asking you to click also on the donation link to contribute $5 or $10 a month or whatever you can do to fuel this movement, because we are the people we've been waiting for. We are the solution we've been waiting for. And so we want to make sure that we have the support necessary to do this. So please consider contributing $5 or $10 to this. And with no further ado, I would like to introduce our guest, Dr. Ibram X. Kendi, and tell you a little bit about him before we bring him on. Dr. Ibram X. Kendi is one of America's most foremost historians and leading anti-racist scholars. He is a National Book Award winning and #1 New York Times bestselling author of 7 books. Kendi is the Andrew W. Mellon Professor in the Humanities and founding director of the Boston University Center for Anti-Racist Research. Kendi is a contributor, writer at The Atlantic, and a CBS News racial justice contributor. He is also the 2020-2021 Francis B. Cashin Fellow at the Red Cliff Institute for the Advanced Study at Harvard University. In 2022, the Times Magazine named him one of the 100 most influential people in the world. And Dr. Kendi is author of The Black Campus Movement, which won the W.E.B. Du Bois Book Prize, and Stamped from the Beginning, The Definitive History of Racist Ideas in America, which won the National Book Award for Nonfiction in 2016. Dr. Kendi is also the author of 4 #1 New York Times bestsellers. We all know the book, How to Be an Anti-Racist, an international bestseller that has been translated in several languages. It made several best books of 2019 list and was described in the New York Times as the most courageous book to date on the problem of race in the Western mind. He also wrote Stamped, Racism, Anti-Racism and You. Also the book Anti-Racist Baby and 400 Souls, a community history of African Americans from 1619 to 2019. Ladies and gentlemen, we welcome Dr. Ibram X. Kendi. Dr. Kendi, welcome. You should be able to put your screen and we will bring you in here.
Yes, thank you so much.
Thank you very much. Yes, thank you very much for having us. This is the Inland Empire's very first Inland Empire Antiracist Summit to make sure that we are part of this anti-racism movement, and we hope that you can help us in discussing and finding our role in this movement. Let's start off just by talking about, we woke up this morning and seeing the horrific events happening in Georgia in which 8 people were murdered, 6 of them a part of the Asian American Pacific Islander community. What are your thoughts about that?
Yeah, I was horrified. I think like anyone else who cares about human beings, who see different human beings as part of the same sort of human community. And so I think just my heart goes out to the AAPI community, but also I know that their struggle is our struggle, because indeed we have white male supremacists who are engaging in acts of terror, not only against the AAPI community, but against Latinx Americans, against obviously Black folks, against Jewish Americans, against women. You name the group, they're being subjected to this terror. And I think then the trauma only persisted, especially when we had police officers taking the word of somebody who just murdered 8 people, and who somehow imagined that this was the result of a bad day as opposed to his lethally racist ideas.
Absolutely. Before we can become anti-racist, I know we have to understand what really racism is. Can you briefly describe what racism is and why it's so important for us to really understand?
Well, I'm happy you ask, because many people who today claim that racism is a thing of the past, and they say that to me, my first question is, okay, so then what is racism? And typically those who are making this case can't even define it, or they define it in a way that doesn't really make much sense, right? So it's easy to say something doesn't exist, you can't even define it, right? But I think in order to understand racism, we have to break down its component parts. And so you have racist policies, which are, or a racist policy is any measure that leads to racial inequity or injustice. You have racist ideas, which are any concepts that suggest a racial group is superior or inferior to another racial group in any way. And so to understand racism, which is inherently systemic, we should understand it as this powerful collection of racist policies that lead to racial inequities and injustices and are substantiated by racist ideas. In other words, voter suppression policies disproportionately make it harder for Black and Brown and Indigenous people to vote, which then leads to them being less likely to vote. And then those policies and their outcome are justified by there's something wrong with those voters as opposed to those policies. In other words, the racist ideas and this mass collection of them justifying the normality of oppression, of inequality that comes out of these policies. That's racism.
Absolutely. And why should we even really care about that, right? I mean, we have so many things coming up right now. We have the coronavirus, we have economic inequality, we have housing and homeless issues. Why should we care about paying a specific attention to the issues of racism?
Well, I think first and foremost, I think it's important for us as human beings to know that there are 3 lethal weapons threatening human existence. For decades, we recognized the possibility of nuclear war. Only recently, we've begun to recognize climate change as an existential threat to human existence. But what's also an existential threat is bigotry more broadly, and racism in particular. And that's precisely what we saw, indeed in the greater Atlanta area last night. And when we look at this nation right now, the greatest domestic terrorist threat of our time are white supremacists who both have racist ideas and weapons. And so it allows for essentially a single person to become like a lynch mob of one, as I wrote about, in an essay. And so I think it's important for us to know that literally, at the most basic level, our security is being threatened. And, it's easy, certainly, I can talk about the security of people of color, but lest we forget that last night, 2 white folks died at the hands of this white supremacist domestic terrorist.
Wow. Well, you keep on bringing the word human and humanity up. And I'm reminded about towards the end of the life of Martin Luther King, of Gandhi, of Malcolm X, even Bobby Seale and others. They always come back to humanity, right? At some point, it was about a specific issue, but then all of a sudden, they said at the end of the day, we have to recognize each other just as human beings. Can you tell me about what your thoughts are when you reflect on humanity and why this is a direct correlation between that and racism?
So I think I think everyone can understand the ways in which racist policies do not allow for certain people to be treated as if they're fully human. And indeed, the racist policies that maintain settler colonialism and slavery and Jim Crow and even mass incarceration today, and even mass deportation, is not treating people as if they're fully human, particularly, folks of color. But I don't think we also pay enough attention to the fact that racist ideas also prevent humans from truly being fully human. And what I mean by that is the longer that I sort of moved in my journey to be anti-racist, the more that I came to appreciate the fullness and the beauty and the diversity and the connection that I had with every single human being living. And then the more that I sort of established and understood that connection, the more I felt fully human. And so what happens, and that's why, a lot of work, of course, recent work, even on, let's say, the enslavement era, have talked about how slavery literally, imagine if you're a slaveholder who is holding people by brute force and violence, who is having to enslave one's own children, who is treating, women as if they're animals who need to, quote, breed. Can you, in that scenario, truly display and act upon the fullness of your humanity? No, just as the victims to that brutality can't either.
Wow. So not only does it hurt the people who is being denied humanity, it's those perpetrators as well. Wow. Tell me about what does it mean to be an anti-racist?
Well, I think first and foremost, it's important for us to realize that we have been taught, humans have been taught, to deny the ways in which they're being racist, to deny every time they express a racist idea, every time they support a policy that's actually maintaining racial injustice, to deny that those ideas and policies are racist, to argue that they're either not racist or can't be racist. But to be anti-racist is first and foremost to recognize that there's this larger system of racism that I talked about earlier. And this system of racism, these racist policies, these racist ideas that are justifying those policies are maintaining racial inequality and injustice in housing, in criminal justice, in the economy, in the environment, in health, you name the sector. And so the question for the individual is, am I challenging that system of racism, or am I upholding it? And there are two ways in which you uphold any status quo, either by actively seeking to sort of figure out ways to suppress more votes so that you can maintain office, or doing nothing in the face of racial inequity, nothing in the face of Jim Crow, nothing in the face of of slavery, nothing in the face of people being mass incarcerated and being mass murdered. Because what's going to happen to that mass murdering, to those mass incarceration, to the mass deportation, if people do nothing? It's going to continue. And so to even do nothing is to uphold this system of racism. So to be anti-racist is to recognize that system, to recognize all these inequities between racial groups are abnormal, to recognize that the cause of those inequities are these racist policies and practices. And of course, to spend our time, to use our abilities to challenge those policies and practices, and certainly the powers that are behind them.
So we want to remind our guest here as we get closer to Q&A time, to make sure that you put your questions in the Q&A function. Do not put your questions in the chat, or we won't be able to see them. Dr. Kendi, you talked about the need, just how dangerous silence is. And it seems like being an anti-racist is very uncomfortable, that we're going to have to make people upset, including our own friends and family. What do you have to say to those who don't want to rock the boat and they think they're just being polite when they allow racist things to be said and they see these type of things? But they feel sorry about it too, Dr. Kendi, right? They wish it didn't happen. And so they don't want to be a part of it, but yet they're silent. Why is that a problem?
So I think it's important for us to think about this in context. So, for instance, how you can have something that is ailing you. I'm sure even there are people on this call right now who's been having a pain somewhere, and have over time just come to deal with it. And so the alternative to just learning how to deal with it is to getting it checked out. Because what happens if we get it checked out? It could be more painful because we have to get treatment. So many of us are like, nah, I'm not gonna, do not take me to no doctor's office. I'm cool with this pain, right? But sometimes that pain persists in the same way, and sometimes it gets worse over time to the point in which we actually do go to the doctor. It's gonna be much harder to treat it, and the pain of healing is going to be that much harder. I'm emphasizing that because even when we do nothing, even when we're silent, I don't want us to just assume that it's still easy. What actually is the case is we're just used to being uncomfortable in that particular way. In other words, we're just used to having a nation where, more than 500,000 people died, of a pandemic. We're just used to having a nation where many of us, if we get sick with a serious illness, we will basically go bankrupt trying to pay for those costs because we don't have a Medicare for all system, because so many, particularly white folks, think, oh, if I don't want those Black and brown folks to get insurance too. We're just used to having a system where if we lose our jobs, there isn't a safety net to catch any of us. Right? We're used to having this type of discomfort, right? And so people imagine that, oh, you know what? I don't want to actually, I'm used to these discomforts. That discomfort over there, which I actually look in the mirror of my own ideas, when I actually go look in the mirror of the policies I've been supporting, when I begin challenging myself, when I begin challenging others, that's a discomfort I'm not used to. So that's harder. Even though that discomfort has the chance to heal us and has the chance to heal our society.
Wow. You mentioned us not being used to society being the way it is. Does any of that have to do with what we saw in January in the insurrection of our country? What part of that did racism have to do with it?
I mean, racism was all over it. I mean, you literally had a series of elected officials, from the president to members of Congress to state legislators, claiming that those people who voted in Phoenix, those people who voted in Atlanta, those people who voted in Philadelphia, in Milwaukee and Detroit, namely Black and brown folks, that they were fraudulent, and thereby the election was stolen, and therefore the former President Trump was the actual winner of the election. And it was believable to people. Why was it believable for folks? It was believable because you essentially had folks who were expressing racist ideas, talking to others who already held racist ideas, and who already believed that voters of color were fraudulent. And indeed, who already imagined that this is a white nation, that when they imagine America, they're really thinking white America, and that only white voters can be legitimate. And so then for them, this idea that those Black and brown illegals and indigenous sort of illegals were taking over this country, riled them up, right? And caused them, of course, to organize together to sack the US Capitol. And then, of course, the police officers there were like, apparently were able to show unbelievable restraint when compared to the lack of restraint they were showing during peaceful protests against racism and police brutality. And I say peaceful because one study last year that tracked nearly 8,000 demonstrations from late May to late August found that 93% of them was peaceful. And I'm a professor. If somebody, gets a 93, that's an A.
Absolutely. Wow. Now, you used some interesting words. You used words like illegal. And in some of your work, you talk about the use of words of savages, and the words that, I remember hearing then President Trump in his own message to the nation talk about rapists and thugs and drug dealers, right? Why do people use that type of language when they describe other people?
So I think first and foremost, if you are a person in a position of power and you are instituting policies that are harming your own voters, your own constituents, specifically white working class men, and even wealthier white men who haven't graduated from college. If you're instituting policies that literally are harming them, right, what are you gonna do? Are you gonna say, oh yeah, the reason why you're struggling right now, the reason why you're suffering right now, the reason why you contracted COVID-19, the reason why your mother died from this disease, the reason why you're losing your business, the reason why you lost your job is because of me? No, that's not what these folks are going to say. They're going to pivot blame from themselves and their own mishandling of the coronavirus and try to blame, Asian Americans. They're going to argue that the reason why people are losing their jobs is because those so-called Latinx invaders. They're going to say that the reason why the government, quote unquote, isn't helping you is because all those Black folks on welfare. They're going to tell their people who are struggling that I am not to blame, even though in reality they are. And then what's going to happen? They're going to believe that those folks of color are the true source of their pain. Then they're going to go after those people of color. And then they're going to continue to struggle, right? And because they're not addressing the source of their pain, and the more they struggle, the more they attack people of color. So it becomes this vicious cycle that we're in right now. And that's why people are so angry. And that's why they're so angry at us, because what's the alternative? The alternative is for them to say that they've been had, that they've been took, that they've been led astray. I didn't mean to sound like Malcolm tonight, but that's essentially the alternative.
Absolutely. So we see different versions of people trying to stand up against racism. Some of it is from a source of pain and a source of anger, but then we see others talk about fighting racism that's rooted in love. Can you talk about what that looks like, but also, what is the best way to address issues of racism?
So I think it is, you have people right now who are suffering, who've lost family members due to state violence or due to domestic terror, and who are angry. And I think they have every right to be angry. And I think they have every right to be angry at racism. And what's striking though, is then you have other folks who are recognizing the source of these folks' pain as racism. And not only the source of the pain of people, but the source of the pain of this country. I mean, this country literally was not almost founded because of racism. Right? They literally went to war against itself in the 1860s because you had a new sort of confederacy that stated it wanted to build a new nation based on the great truth that the Negro is not equal to the white man, and slavery subordination to the superior race is his natural and normal condition, to quote the vice president of the Confederacy, Alexander Stephens. You literally right now, if we can't see the ways in which racism is harming the nation, right, then I'm not sure what more evidence that people can see. And then those of us who are diagnosing the illness, who are diagnosing the disease, we're told we're anti-American. Can you imagine that? So the people who are like, no, America, you do not have metastatic racism. And those people who are trying to drag you into the hospital for treatment, and those people who are diagnosing you, and those people who are telling you you have metastatic racism, since it hurts you, they're trying to hurt you. And since the treatment will be painful, they're trying to bring you that pain, and they're against the country. No, those are the people who actually don't love. Those are the people who hate the nation. The people who love a nation are the people who are going to look a nation in the mirror and tell it what it is. Just like we know those people who really love us, they're going to tell it like it is to us.
Wow. So both San Bernardino and Riverside counties have declared racism a public health crisis. And of course, as we all suspect, 2020 is more people did their affirmations that racism is wrong. How do we turn our affirmation into action now?
I think every single one of us, and I'm speaking to individual people, every single one of us, we live in a community. We may have a specific passion or area of expertise or area of interest, whether that's criminal justice, whether that's the environment, whether that's the economy, whether that's health, whether that's politics. And so I think it's important for every single one of us to think about what is in our backyard, what sector, what community, and then what are the organizations in that specific space and place that are fighting systemic racism. Because chances are there are organizations that exist, chances are there are individuals, policymakers who are fighting against racist policies. And then the next question comes for each of us as individuals: what do we have to give? In other words, how can we support those organizations? Can we lend our expertise? Can we support the organization, donate to the organization? Can we volunteer for the organization? Can we lead the organization? And I'm saying organization because it's going to take organized bodies of people to challenge housing insecurity in a particular community. It's going to take organized bodies of people to reimagine public safety, in a particular community. And so we need to join with other people because it's our power together that allows us to really be able to battle racist power.
When we talk about racist policies, and we talk about the data that has come out of what we have learned, and I've seen on the post of your own center about you've been really tracking coronavirus's effects and how that correlates to racism. Can you tell us what the coronavirus has taught us about racism and racist policies?
Sure. So I can first say that about this time last year, you had some people saying the coronavirus was the great equalizer. By the end of this month, last year, we had our first, some of the first counties and states released racial demographic data on coronavirus patients. We found that Black people were being infected and killed at higher rates. By mid-April of last year, we knew that Black, Brown, and Indigenous people were being infected and killed at the highest rates from COVID-19. But then the initial explanation for that was that, well, it's because those folks are not taking the coronavirus seriously. It's because they're not socially distancing. Why are they behaving so recklessly? That's why those Black folks are getting infected and killed. But of course, by the end of April, you had large numbers of people that were overwhelmingly white demonstrating to reopen states. So then it became hard for people to claim that it was Black folks or Latinx folks or Indigenous folks who weren't taking this coronavirus seriously. Then the racist narrative shifted to, well, it's because those folks have all those pre-existing conditions. And they have those pre-existing conditions because they're so lazy, because they don't want to exercise, because they don't want to eat right, or because they have a genetic predisposition to those pre-existing conditions. Again and again, the narrative was, Black people in particular were dying at the highest rates as they have throughout the pandemic because there's something wrong with Black people. But what we found by the summer, we started actually studying the reasons why and didn't automatically assume it's because there's something wrong with Black people. We found it's because Black folks were less able to work from home, like Latinx and Indigenous people. We found that Black folks were more likely to live in what's called trauma deserts, in which you don't have access to high quality, life-saving care. And that was critical because Black folks, studies show, were also less likely to have health insurance. And so as a result, Black folks were more likely to present to hospitals at a later stage. And then that combined with lesser levels of life-saving care was a horrible combination, combined with the fact that Black folks, even middle-income Black folks, were more likely to live in neighborhoods with higher levels of air and water pollution. And so you had all these factors that were the result of our past and present racist policies that created these conditions that then led to, folks of color, dying, at higher rates. And I think so it showed in a way only possibly a pandemic can, the life of racism in this country.
One of our sponsors is the Southern California News Group. And of course, before this summit, they did an article on this and put some ads in. And for those of us who know what it means to have an article out about a certain subject you care about, you know that one of the worst things you can do is read the comment section.
Yeah, don't read the comment section in my tweets.
And unfortunately, I made the mistake of reading the comment section. And wow. Number one, a question that I'll ask you, because this was always one of those things, is that the denial that white supremacy actually exists and racism is just a made up thing. What do you say to those folks?
So when someone argues again that racism doesn't exist, my response is, okay, so then what is racism? And ironically, when I draw that out, what you find is the only way in which people can claim that racism doesn't exist is by expressing racist ideas. So that's the irony. You know how that's the case? Well, why is it? If racism doesn't exist, why is it that Black folks have died at twice the rate of white people over the course of this pandemic? And the only explanation for that is that there's something wrong with Black people if you're not going to say racism. Or what they'll say is, they'll say it's, oh, it's about class, or it's about income, or it's about poverty. Okay, so then why is it that Black folks are disproportionately poor? Why is it that white folks are disproportionately wealthy? Why is it that Black poor people are far and away less likely than white poor people to live in mixed income neighborhoods? Why is it that Black women who are middle income with college degrees are more likely to die in pregnancy than working class white women who haven't even graduated from high school? Why is that the case? And you go on and on, right? And so then either they don't say nothing, right? Or they just go back to, well, it's because of their behavior, i.e. racist ideas.
Now, we live here in the Inland Empire, San Bernardino and Riverside counties. There are some evidence that we get our name Inland Empire from the KKK stronghold being one of the capitals of KKK here in California. We have cities that at some point, those of us who grew up here were told that make sure you're not in that city before once the sun goes down. You have streets here in the Inland Empire where they used to hold annual KKK parades. You still have some city council members who continuously fights against racism, that fight against anti-racism, I should say. And there's a movement going now, even in Riverside County, where we're trying to get the Riverside County Board of Supervisors to support the notion that it's time to take involuntary servitude out of California's Constitution. What are your, and of course, once that got on the agenda, it has been delayed 3 times because our district attorney, Michael Hestron, decided to rally up folks to talk against it. Is there a connection between racism and involuntary servitude being on some state's constitution, of course, even in our nation's constitution?
So, as Ava DuVernay brilliantly sort of showed in her film 13th. When slavery ended, the law replaced the master, and the prison replaced the plantation. And that's why, for instance, in 1866 and in 1865, you had this flood of what were called black codes, specifically, in the now supposedly former Confederate states, in which they were like, oh, we can still enslave these people by the law. Oh, you know what? We can establish this convict lease system in which we round up Black folks and charge them with petty crimes and tell them they have to pay off their fine before they get out of prison, and then lease them out to somebody who's going to pay their fines. I mean, or even now you have so many prisoners who are making products for companies, or in the case of states like, I'm sure in California, and the same thing in New York, in which you literally have, during slavery, Southern states, because they counted Black folks as 3/5 of people, slaveholders and their population were greater in many cases. They were much stronger politically, but now it's 5/5 of a person. In other words, you have a prison in your rural white area. Those prisoners are counted towards the population, not of the Black and brown communities that they came from, but the rural white areas, right? That's right now all over this country.
It hurts to see, especially we're almost at the anniversary of George Floyd's murder. And we've seen many sheriffs and police chiefs begin to make reforms. But we have one sheriff who has refused to make any reforms because he thinks what we're doing is fine. What do you have to say to people like that, like Sheriff Bianco, who is refusing to make any type of reform reflective of the murders of Black people?
I mean, it just goes to show that, well, let me just sort of say this. If you are in a profession that has almost no outside accountability, and you're going to create, it's going to create a situation in which people are so used to, it's norm to act indiscriminately, right, without repercussion, that the thought that your job will be like mine, in other words, I can't just do whatever I want, right? In almost every other job in this country, folk can't just do whatever they want. They certainly can't kill people and just claim they were fearing for their life, and then everybody around them is going to protect them like this blue wall, and then they're going to be investigated by themselves, right? And then the people who are supposed to be charging them are also people they work with on a daily basis. In no other area is that the case. In no other sector is that the case. And so it doesn't surprise me when you have police officers, and specifically leaders of police officers, who refuse accountability, who refuse to be held accountable by outside forces. And so in that scenario, that's why we need the people. That's why we need a movement to compel it, because many of these folks are not going to allow it. Now, let me also state that some police officers are recognizing that indeed they have been put in an impossible situation. In other words, you have a society that calls
Black and brown and indigenous folks, animals and rapists and criminals and murderers and terrorists, and that this violence is the result of their animal nature. So we can't, it's not the result that these folks are more likely to live in high poverty neighborhoods and neighborhoods with higher levels of employment. And around the world, you have higher levels of poverty and unemployment. You tend to have higher levels of violent crime. No. It's something wrong with these people. And so then we arm these officers, give them tanks, and it's imagine that those people are dangerous, their neighborhoods are dangerous, and there's quote nothing that we can do about it other than throw them all in prison or deport them. And so you're a police officer who's put in that situation. You're asked to respond to mental health crises when you ain't got no training for that. You're asked to respond to basic traffic stops. You're asked to respond to nonviolent domestic incidents. You're asked to respond to all different types of things because we haven't actually funded our public health system. We haven't funded mental health services. We haven't funded social services. We haven't funded our infrastructure. And I'm saying this because that's why you have people like, you know what, maybe we should shift funds. And you have some officers like, actually, that would be a good idea because it would relieve pressure off of me to have to be the social problem solver of this society.
So we're almost at the end of our discussion time and moving into Q&A. And I would remiss to ask you, what can everyday people do to fight against racism?
I think in addition to sort of what I said earlier in terms of finding those organizations, specifically local organizations, that you can join or support, I would say that it's also important to really support those leaders, those elected officials, even those executives, those people in positions of power who are striving to eliminate racist policies, who are striving to institute anti-racist solutions. And the reason being is because they are pushing up against the status quo. And their job is extremely hard. And the easy way out is to just reinforce the status quo. And so I also want us to figure out how can we, support those people in positions of power. But then some of us should be striving to be in those positions of power so that we then can use those positions for the greater good as opposed to for the greater of us, as too many people do.
Wow. A touchy subject is we've started to see many articles of people leaving organizations like the Southern Baptist Convention. And we started to hear about concerns with the white evangelical Christians. Why are people concerned with that?
I mean, when you actually look at the political views of too many white evangelicals, how can, what is it, upwards of 80% of white evangelicals, last I checked, support a president who, by almost every measure, I was raised in the church, and I sermon after sermon would teach us how we're not supposed to be, and he was the poster child for that. And 80% of white evangelicals are supporting somebody like that. I think for so many people who are serious about their religious teachings or about the teaching of Christianity, the hypocrisy, I think, became too great. It's too great. And they realize that some of these folks who call themselves Christians are really, worshiping whiteness.
Wow. we heard we heard that many people get upset when we call those who voted for Trump, not the first time, the second time. And they making the argument that just because I voted for him doesn't mean I'm racist. What are your thoughts about that?
So, I mean, in my work, I don't consider racist to be who a person is, but what a person is doing or not doing in any given moment. And indeed, whenever anyone votes for someone who has a racist record as president, in that moment, they're being racist.
James Baldwin had an interesting quote about those who said that they loved him. And paraphrasing, he basically said that, you know, it's okay if we disagree, unless your disagreement and your position actually denies my own humanity and my own quality of life. What do you think he meant by that?
Well, I think that what Baldwin meant is that I think robust debate and discussion in disagreement is absolutely important, and I think we should foster that. But we shouldn't be debating over whether Black people are human. We shouldn't be debating over whether inequity is the result of racism, as opposed to the inferiority of Latinx people. We shouldn't be debating about whether white supremacist domestic terror is the greatest is the greatest sort of national security threat of our time. Those are certain things we should not be debating. Now, we should be debating, okay, how do we eliminate this problem? How do we eliminate racism? You know, what can we do? What are the solutions? There's all sorts of serious debates within that, but I'm not going to debate somebody who devalues my humanity. I'm not going to get on stage and argue, oh, I am a human. I mean, like, you know, that's a basic, that to me is a basic baseline position, you know, that we should all have.
So we're going to ask Jernine to come on, who's been taking questions, looking at the Q&A, and be able to propose just a few questions before our time is up. Jernine, do you have our first question?
Hi, good evening, everyone. Hello, Dr. Kendi. It's great to be here with you.
Hello.
Our first question someone has is, Professor Kendi, what are your thoughts about people who say your racist amendment is too broad? How would I engage with these specific people who don't believe America has racist laws?
I would ask them, the way that I would engage would be to ask those people, what are, you know, you choose a racial inequity, whether it's, you know, Black folks are disproportionately poor, whether it's, you know, Black folks are disproportionately incarcerated, and ask them, why is that the case? And what they're typically going to argue is, again, some sort of thing that's wrong with Black folks. And I think it's important for us to show those folks that indeed, here are the laws, here are the policies that are actually behind those inequities that we need to change.
Next question.
Sure. Now, this question is for both, I would say, Dr. Kendi and you, Corey. So we have a comment. Yesterday, 2 teens in Rochester, New York, set a 53-year-old mentally ill man on fire. It appears to be a hate crime. Can we organize protests, please? what would next steps be? And I see no mention of it on destroyracism.org.
So I think the local, I think those who, I think you said in Rochester, I think those in Rochester should certainly organize, a demonstration, against that, that vicious crime. Exactly how they would do it is, the circumstances on the ground is not something that I know.
Yeah, definitely. Next question.
If 50% of the people in the USA voted for a racist president and 50% of the current Senate support racist policies, how can we uphold our strengths to continue to fight the pervasive racism that has existed in our country for several centuries? What are specifically additional ways we can find to gain more traction towards progress?
I think at the local level, our city governments, our county governments, our school boards, they have policy-making power that can literally create more equity and justice for people in those communities. Indeed, it is the case that that 50 of the senators are probably not even going to support a voting rights bill when there's clear and pervasive evidence of the assault against the voting rights of Americans. And so we can't necessarily rely, on the federal government, particularly the Senate, especially since the filibuster still exists. And so I think we have to turn to our local communities.
Right. How do you feel education needs to be restructured to address these issues?
Wow. I think that it's important for our educational system to reflect that last time I checked, the United States was a multiracial, multi-ethnic, multicultural society. And, I think our schools and our curriculums should reflect our nation, our world. I think it's also important for our teachers and our educators and our schools and our curriculums to actively teach our students to be anti-racist, meaning actively teach students, young people that, even the youngest of people, that there's nothing right about you because of the color of your skin, just like there's nothing wrong about you because of the color of your skin or the texture of your hair. And everyone who says there is something wrong with you, there's actually something wrong with their ideas. I think we have to actively teach people this because we live in a dangerously racist society that is especially dangerous for young people because you have all these racist messages, constantly raining on their heads, and our educational system, has to protect them.
Dr. Kendi, I've been thinking about how our workplace and how our school systems reinforce white supremacy. And I bring up, and actually I remember reading in your book, when we see people dressed a certain way, when we see people, their hair a certain way, we automatically make a assumption of who is of greater quality, of more professional than others. How do we constantly see white supremacists practicing this being used in our schools and our workplace?
Think about it. Our students, our young people, we were not systematically taught that to understand and equate difference. Like that's a skill that you'll learn when you see something that is different, for you to know that all you're seeing is something or someone that is different. It's actually, especially in this society, you have to be systematically taught that. But instead we're taught to attach particular skin color or the way people dress or hair texture or the way people talk or the languages that people use
two particular behavioral traits. We're also taught that when a single Black person is acting negatively, it's not just one Black person, it's tens of millions of people. Apparently, that single Black person is representative of all Black people, right? Apparently, when that one Black person is being lazy, we're all being lazy, right? We're taught that. And that's the common sense. And it's just a ridiculous idea, but we're taught to, when we have a bad experience with a single person, to make it representative of that group, as opposed to, that's a single person. They're not representative of anyone but themselves.
I think, Janine, we have time for maybe one or two more questions.
Okay. 6 of the 8 people murdered in Atlanta were specifically AAPI women. How do we unpack the multiple layers of oppression, or as Professor Kimberly Crenshaw calls it, intersectionality, especially as we seek to practice real change?
Well, I think it's absolutely essential that we do. And I think it's absolutely essential that we recognize that shooter specifically, according to the outcome of his actions, targeted Asian women, which is the result of both, not only his racist ideas towards Asian Americans, not only his sexist ideas towards women, but the intersection of those racist and sexist ideas. And so we're not going to be able to fully understand what Asian Americans are facing, what Black Americans are facing, what any group is facing, if we don't understand the ways in which certain groups are being targeted at an intersectional level. So even like Asian, I think, one group put out a report that found that 70% of the Asian Americans who've been targeted are women. And so, what is happening there? And we're not going to be able to understand that without both, not only a racial analysis and a gender analysis, but also, analysis at its intersection. And there are specific racist ideas that have targeted Asian women, specifically around their sexuality. And so that's why it's not surprising. There's actually a connection between what this professed shooter claimed about these Asian women and racist ideas about Asian women. And I think we would know that as a human community if we actually knew the history of anti-Asian racism, specifically against women.
And in closing, Janine, just one more question, and this will be the last one, and then we'll move on to the rest of our program.
Okay. Final question. In a lifelong anti-racism crusade, what is your best tip to refuel and replenish the soul?
Wow.
I would say that just, for me, it's just love. Despite all the hate out there, whether it's through my...
Heard in our last segment with Dr. Kendi. And so I will start in my upper left corner with Dr. Carolyn Murray. Please briefly introduce yourself and give me some of your key takeaways from the last segment.
Well, thank you so much, and good evening, everyone. I'm Carolyn Bennett Murray, and I'm a professor of psychology at the University of California, Riverside. And my research has focused on something called the condition failure model, which is an alternative to understanding the achievement gap. And also, I look at issues such as racial identity and racism in healthcare. In terms of my takeaway from Dr. Kendi, but first of all, there was nothing I found lacking in his characterization of racist America. I think that was very comprehensive. However, now after saying that, I would be remiss if I did not comment on an issue I have with his book. And I'm hoping that I can be allowed with the minute I have left to say a few words.
Sure.
Dr. Kendi's thesis is, first of all, brilliant. It's engaging and it's thought-provoking. He has created a personalized piece that's appealing to both white liberals and Black assimilationists, and at the same time calling on all of us to be anti-racist. So when I say thought-provoking, I'm really saying infuriating. He has ignored the leading Black scholars' definition of racism, which is that it's a product resulting from transmission of race prejudice and or ethnocentrism through the exercise of power against a racial group defined as inferior by individuals and institutions with the intentional and unintentional support of the entire culture. And that came from James Jones. I'm going to call him the leading scholar on prejudice and racism in America. That's 1996. Instead, he has championed a white definition of racism that anyone and everyone, from oppressors to the oppressed, can be, and by many of his examples, are racist. So while our children are tracked into prisons by their racist white teachers, our blood runs in the street, victims of white racist police officers, our communities are redlined by our own government to keep us impoverished, and many other just as horrendous activities on the part of white people, Black people are told in this book, not tonight, but in this book, that we are just as racist because we use the N-word, we lighten our skin, we call white people devils, and we carry out deeds on the behalf of whites, such as rigging elections and supporting policies that are detrimental to our own people. Of course, we saw that with Connolly, and Clarence Thomas.
Yeah, thank you, Dr. Murray. Let me just move us through because we have a few more questions, okay? And I appreciate this, and I know you're talking specifically about Dr. Kendi's book, How to Be an Anti-Racist, and if others of you haven't read it, then you can read it and also kind of, see how you mesh with what Dr. Murray has been talking about. I am going to move to Dr. Alexander June. So again, Dr. June, please introduce yourself and give your comments about our Kendi segment.
Thank you very much. Good to see everyone this evening. Alexander Jun, I'm a professor of higher education at Azusa Pacific University, and I join you today with much grieving and lamenting what's been happening. Not just this most recent event, but all year for many years, not just during the coronavirus, but it's been going on for generations. And so I almost didn't want to join today. I just wanted to take a nap, but I took a nap and I joined. So here we are. I really appreciate being here. Most of the research I've been doing the last few years, my last 3 books have been on white supremacy and addressing what Christopher Collins and I refer to the white architecture of the mind, trying to understand what the everyday ways of thinking is for a dominant society. And we also include work. I identify as a Christian, and one of the best things I appreciated about what Dr. Kendi said is, when you love someone, you talk about real things, and you challenge the very things and can be critical with the ones you love. And so I love the church, and I can be very critical of the church in my love. And so one of the books we wrote is White Jesus, the architecture of racism in education and the church. Probably one of my biggest takeaways was when Dr. Kendi was talking about what it means to be un-American. And I was reminded once again that racism is so tied to American culture and American history that when you challenge racism, you're called un-American. A little later, we talked about Christianity, and it was the same thing, that Christianity is so conflated with Americanness and whiteness that when you challenge whiteness, Christians are offended. Right. And they say it's unbiblical. So those are some initial thoughts that I have that I'd love to explore deeper. But thank you so much for having me.
Thank you, Dr. Jun. I'm going to move to Dr. Noemi Hernandez Alexander next.
Good evening. Thank you so much, Janice. It's such a pleasure to be here. Yes, my name is Noemi Hernandez Alexander. I am a political scientist, race, ethnicity, and politics scholar. My area of research is Latino politics and religion. I am a political scientist, a political science professor and public administration professor at California Baptist University. And I'm also a proud member of Antiracist Riverside. I'm going to kind of pull back and kind of go back to what Dr. Kendi was implying, but his whole work kind of speaks to as a historian. One of the things that really marks me is that history shows us that anti-racist policy demands are usually met with fear-based resistance. But then soon after those policies are implemented, we see support for those policies. We saw support, for example, for racial integration in schools and communities after Brown v. Board and after it was legal, that desegregation was a little bit more implemented throughout the nation. We saw support for interracial marriage after anti-miscegenation laws were overturned in the 60s and the 70s. Social safety net policies like unemployment, Medicare, Medi-Cal, Social Security, the Affordable Care Act. In each of these cases, there was this fear-based response and resistance. But once those policies get implemented, those fears don't come to pass. And once people see that those fears don't come to pass, they start to enjoy the benefits of these policies and actually defend them. And so to go back to some of the tenets that Dr. Kendi brings up is that racism hurts everyone, but anti-racist policies benefit everyone.
Sure. Thank you very much. And I am going to now go to our last panelist here is Dr. Salim Faraji. Thank you very much for being here this evening. And again, introduce yourself and give us your take on Dr. Kendi.
Yes, let me say good evening to everyone. Inland Empire, of course, like all of you, I enjoyed Dr. Kendi this evening and even the comments, the dialogue, the commentary. I'm Dr. Salim Faraji. I'm a professor of Africana Studies at California State University, Dominguez Hills. I am a historian. I'm also a theologian and philosopher as well. I do have a seminary background as well. I've been teaching at Cal State Dominguez Hills for a little over 16 years now. And my area of specialization is actually African history, African diaspora history, African civilizations, and its intersection with the global community, with the world and so forth, which I think is a major, major omission in our discussion of racism and anti-racism. I think it's a major omission that we don't understand not only the history of the United States, but also the history of the globe, with particular reference to Africa and the African diaspora and its intersection with Asia, the South Pacific and the Americas, and certainly Europe as well. I just want to make this statement. Anti-racism cannot be the focal point of our discussion about dismantling race. Anti-racism cannot be the focal point in our discussion and practice about dismantling racism and white supremacy. The word anti-racist itself is defined by its own binary or its own opposite, which is race. So we have a pendulum, race, anti-race, and so forth. And what happens is that legitimizes and allows the discourse of race to remain at the center of our humanity. And what I want to propose this evening is that we as human beings are older, we're prior, and far more profound than the constructs of race that have been invented and promulgated throughout the world for the past 5 centuries. And so in order to dismantle it, I believe, I assert, we have to step outside of the racial paradigm and construct entirely. You know, one of the issues that Dr. Kendi raised in his book, Stamped from the Beginning, and I know my colleague, Dr. Murray, was talking about how to be an anti-racist. Stamped from the Beginning is actually my favorite of the 2 books, right? I think it's more, first of all, it's a history book. But one of the things he says, many things, he says that racist power cannot be persuaded away from its self-interest. Racist power cannot be persuaded away from its self-interest. And he
Thank you.
began by talking about his policies, and
Right.
so about how racist policies support
Right.
racist interests.
So thank you, Dr. Faraji. I'm going to move on to our next question for our panelists and pretty much take the same order. So this question is, what should the anti-racist movement look like? And I get, Dr. Faraji, that, you know, from your perspective, anti-racist shouldn't even be in play here, but it is. And it has been taken, at least I know, in our work in Anti-Racist Riverside, as doing the work necessary to eliminate racism, and specifically systemic racism, because the individual I can't control, but I can do a lot more with the systems. And so, Dr. Murray, I am going to take it to you first. You know, what should the anti-racist movement look like?
Well, of course, it should be a rainbow coalition. I'm totally in agreement with that. It should be a rainbow coalition. And we should begin to recognize how we perpetuate racism, because I think to a certain extent, like the definition said, the intentional and unintentional support of the entire culture. So to a certain degree, each one of us plays a role in that perpetuating racism. But at the same time, we need to call it out and call it what it is. I do agree with my colleague, Dr. Faraji, and it cannot be necessarily race at the center. But at the same time, these injustices should be at the center. And we should clearly specify that we will not stand for injustice against anybody.
Right. Dr. John.
Yeah, I'm going to build on that wonderful comment, Professor Murray. The idea of objectifying human beings. And this is what, again, we see the intersectionality of race as it's played out with what happened yesterday with Asian women. The sexualization, the fetishizing of Asian women within our cultures, right? Not seeing them as fully human. We see it in media, we see it in music, and it's not just as much as I write about white supremacy, all of our communities. And these are conversations that I think critical to happen. It's all under a larger umbrella of white supremacy that I acknowledge. And part of the challenge of the movement would be to squarely identify and name white supremacy. And at the same time, in our own communities, for myself in Asian American communities, addressing colorism and anti-Blackness. And that's something that in our communities we need to do. And then Black communities, Latinx communities, I'm hoping the same thing would happen in terms of how we fetishize Asian women and objectify Asian women. Comments that you hear, the songs, the way things are portrayed. And there needs to be, in that sense, some solidarity as we're working together. Today was a good example of that. I didn't speak as much about anti-Asian hatred as many others did already, and that was encouraging. We need Asian Americans to speak up. Black Lives Matter. Yeah. We need other folks to be addressing these things so that it's not always when it's your turn. And this is a challenge that I have for a lot of Asian Americans. Maybe not fully feeling the full weight of what's been going on, not understanding what happened to George Floyd, Ahmaud Arbery, Breonna Taylor, and many, many, many others, until it starts happening more in your own community. And then people are starting to realize and recognize it. And so these are conversations that we need to be having in our own groups as well as across groups.
Right. Dr. Hernandez Alexander.
Yeah, so I think the anti-racist movement will require three things: education, policy change, and moral courage. I maintain that the hearts and minds of the power brokers do need to be changed in order for there to be a lasting change, but I don't think it's a prerequisite. Education and moral courage need to work in tandem, though, and in conjunction with demands for policy change. Demands for changes in the policy and in the power structures that knowingly or unknowingly perpetuate racist policies. And so for those educators on the call, influencers, leaders of communities, organizations, or even leaders of your own kitchen table, as you have conversations, we need to start with expanding our narrative away from a Eurocentric narrative into one that is a fuller story, one that incorporates Black, Indigenous, and people of color, because that is the American story. We need to re-centralize all peoples into our American stories. And I also believe that if we want to heal as a nation, we must first start with the truth, telling the truth about our country, a truth that leads to a racial reckoning, and a reckoning that leads to a national repentance, and a repentance that leads to a replacing or a repairing of broken systems, and a reparation that invites forgiveness. Then we can enter into the work of racial reconciliation that we really desperately desire.
Thank you. Dr. Faraji?
Yeah, I don't want to give the impression that I don't think race is a construct that has very consequences and repercussions. But what I'm saying is that we live in a society that's preoccupied by that construct, as opposed to focusing on who we really are. And so much of trying to get at racial reconciliation or policy and so forth, none of that can happen if you don't know one another. Each other's history, culture, language, traditions, customs, practices. There's no way we're going to work and form the type of multi-ethnic coalitions without knowing one another. So with my students, you know, I'm taking my students to Silai Buddhist Temple, right, in Hacienda Heights, California. I love that temple. It's a refuge, or a mosque, if you will, or certainly African American. Not only that, but other cultures and other traditions, indigenous sweat lodge and things of that nature. We have to come out of our own spaces and interact with other spaces, even literary, right? Have you studied the Upanishads? Have you studied the Tao Te Ching? Have you studied Buddhist literature? Have you studied the great authors in Latinx community and so forth? Asian Pacific, Pacific Islander and so forth, certainly Africa and the African diaspora.
Sure.
I think that's a prerequisite of mobilizing people, getting people familiar with one another, and certainly the foundation of who we are, right? All human beings, biologically and genetically, emerged from the first humans that stood on the African continent millions and hundred thousands of years ago in Uganda, Rwanda, Burundi, Congo, Kenya, South Africa, Ethiopia, Eritrea, Sudan, Egypt. This is a fact. And these humans populated the entire globe. They went to Europe. They went to what is now the Middle East. They went to Asia, the South Pacific. They went to the Americas and so forth, and they adapted to their environment. And ever since that time, we have been interacting. So the ideology of white supremacy and racism has attempted to privilege one particular group, right, and leverage it for one thing and one thing only, for power. And so if we begin with our humanity, which is what Dr. Kendi was saying earlier, and for me, humanity suggests from an African perspective and other indigenous perspectives, first of all, we're cosmic. We come from the universe. We come from creation, the cosmos, right? Not only that, we also all have an African genetic biological origin, right? We're incredibly diverse, right? With our cultures and language. It's those type of things that have to be respected, honored, and taught from K through 12 before you get to UC Riverside, before you get to Cal State Dominguez, before you get to Azusa Pacific. This has to be in the curricula, right? An authentic human history and authentic appreciation for who we are, a radical love and commitment to who human beings are and to all our diversity, right? So
Thank you.
That's really what I'm preparing.
Sure, got you. Thank you very much. I mean, it is, I'm going to interject here just a little bit because it is important for people to understand what happened from 1600 forward, to understand the body of systemic racism and how it works and why it's successful and what we have to do to get rid of it. But, you know, African Americans did not start at the shores of the United States or the Caribbean. We had, you know, thousands of years of culture and all kinds of things. And I do not think the Pythagorean theorem was created in Greece because there are pyramids in Egypt. So, you know, there's a lot that people don't.
Mexico and believe.
Oh, absolutely,
Yes.
absolutely.
In Guatemala.
Sure. We traveled the globe. So let me move on to what I think is going to be our last question for the panel, and then we're going to have questions from the audience. And that is, what can individuals do to fight against racism? And I will go to you again, Dr. Murray. I think your mic is off.
I'm so sorry.
That's okay.
My colleague, Dr. Alexander, really hit the nail on the head: education. The first book that I read that really kind of changed things in the way I was thinking about issues around white supremacy was a book that talked about redlining and the policies of our own federal government. We're supposed to have a meritocracy, and that's what they teach white people, that there's a meritocracy. There's never been a meritocracy. There are hundreds of laws on the books that give white people an advantage. They don't know that. They need to know that. They need to know about how they were made to be middle class by the government. They didn't lift themselves up by their bootstraps. They were issued a pair of bootstraps by the government in housing, and that housing became their piggy bank. And they were able to go into the middle class while the government at the same time put its foot on our necks by redlining our homes and our communities. And so until they understand, and they're always talking about they want the government out of their business. If government got out of their business, I think they would just fall down and die. But anyway, but they just need to be, first of all, educated. Then they can make an intelligent decision about some of the things that they're supporting. But until they get, and our school system is just dismal and sad and does not teach. And a lot of the white teachers don't even know that. So they can't even appreciate our children at all.
Thank you, Dr. Murray. Dr. John?
Yes, education. It was intentionally or unintentionally miseducation for generations. That was what we have now. It's bearing fruit. And so we need, for some of us, re-education, for others of us, remedial education. It's some basics. And so there's formal learning through books that you can do, and then also informal, challenging even modern day assumptions, and being able to hear other narratives, not the dominant narrative that continues to drive and feed American society. You know, one example, and again, Dr. Kendi was talking about this with the Capitol riots. It's fascinating responses. You think of 9/11, right? What was the response that happened after 9/11? Mosques were burned, people were randomly attacked in the streets. You see all this violence enacted across the country to Arab American citizens. What did you see after the Capitol riots in January? Did we see churches being burned? Did we see random acts of violence for white men ages 25 to 55? Was there a ban on Christian nations? The danger that they might be coming into the United States as international students, but really just radicalized Christian terrorists? None of that happened.
Right.
So we have to be able to recognize the inconsistencies in policies and challenge dominant narratives that are formal and informal in our education system.
Thank you. Dr. Hernandez Alexander.
So moving from education, right? We've heard the adage that knowledge is power, but knowledge is only power if we apply it for the struggle of power. And one of the ways that organizations can share power, and I'm going to give some tools to actually be able to do something in our organizations, anti-racist work in our organizations, is to take an assessment of your organization's practices and policies. Check in with your people from the volunteer all the way up to the executive and ask, what does racism look like in our organization? Now, unless you're running a dark warehouse full of robots, all humans and therefore all organizations have blind spots and biases. And so we have to ask the questions, what are the outcomes, intentionally or unintentionally, what are the outcomes and the practices and the policies that we employ? How do they affect the people we serve? How do they affect the people that work here? Who do they hurt? Who do they advantage? And if you find out that some of your benign, general, non-race related policies have race-based outcomes and consequences, then we do the brave work of creating race-based solutions. Okay. And most importantly, resist the temptation to focus on fixing the offended party, the employee, the foster child, the unhoused, the constituent. Because historically, the solutions offered to correct racial disparities have continuously been to try to fix the oppressed and the powerless, as if there's something innately wrong with them. This is like watching the sun go down and blaming the house for getting dark, instead of asking, did the owner pay the house the light bill? Did she turn on the light before she left the house? So we need to ask a different set of questions. We need to ask what's wrong with the systems that the powerless need to navigate in our society.
Thank you.
The reimagining of policies and power structures, which is another component of our work.
Okay, thank you, thank you. And finally to you, Dr. Faraji, what can individuals do to fight against racism?
Well, one of the participants put in the chat that, we're suggesting, of course, educators.
I want to be Zoom patient because, it'll come back in. And I don't know if Dr. Faraji is out for the duration or not, but he's stuck, and I think that's evident to most of us. I would like him to be able to respond. But I am going to set up for questions because I think he may be able to get his point in through one of our other questions. And so I am going to hand over to Janine McBride of CART to, bring forward some of our participant questions from the Q&A. Thank you, Janine.
Oh, of course. So let me start with this question. To what degree are Black educators culpable with school systems as we go along with racist policies and systems?
Dr. Murray?
Well, we're miseducated also. We're all miseducated. Unfortunately, we don't know the true history of this country and the role it has played globally. We are colonializers and we don't even recognize that. And so we need to, like I said, we need a total overhaul of our educational system so that Black educators can be at the forefront of any kind of change.
Dr. Hernandez Alexander? I think my screen moved around. Sorry, Dr. John. I'll get back to you.
Yeah, we've been conditioned, right? And we're responding to the systems that we work within. And often, even if we're doing the anti-racist work and it's our desire to do that, we have to work within the systems that we are working within, whether it be the halls of education or higher education. So that's unfortunate. That there has to be an unlearning, but we have to enlist our institutions to be a part of the truth telling.
Janine, could you repeat the question for Dr. Faraji? He's back in now.
So the first question is, to what degree are Black educators culpable with school systems as we go along with racist policies and systems?
I mean, that's a good question. I don't put the onus on Black educators in terms of systemic delivery of proper education. Like, I mean, we remember Carter G. Woodson, right? Classic African-American historian, considered the father of Black history, did his PhD at Harvard, right? Founder of Black History Month. His classic book, The Miseducation of the Negro, right? And in his work, he says, look, educated Black folk are taught to despise themselves and despise African history, despise African culture, and to show contempt for themselves, but valorize the Greek, the Roman, the Latin, the Teuton, right, and so forth. And so, that still hasn't changed fundamentally in the educational system, although there's been some incremental changes on the surface. But fundamentally, that major thrust is there. And so I think there are countless educators in school districts over the past 30, 40 years, in particular, all over the country, right, that's been attempting to create a more inclusive, a more multicultural, more multi-ethnic oriented curriculum that centers on what I call authentic human history. Of course, is resistance to those changes, right? In the state of Texas, maybe about 10 years ago, the state of Texas was conducting an audit at the University of Texas and Texas A&M. They were doing an audit to see how many courses were offered in what they called race studies, critical race theory, gender studies, diversity studies, and so forth, with the aim of excluding and removing those courses from the curriculum, right? This was maybe about 10 years ago. And so there's a constant fight, if you will, and struggle, right, to bring this to bear in K through 12, as well as in higher education, right? We see that California was a long fight. The state of California Ethnic Studies Bill was just signed by Governor Newsom, and Dr. Shirley Weber was responsible for pushing that through the legislative halls of our state and so forth. And so I think people are working, but there's resistance because of the goal of wanting to maintain the status quo of white superiority and a narrative that only celebrates Western civilization.
Thank you. Dr. Jun.
Yeah, that's exactly right. We have to recognize the systemic and structural nature of education that educated Black educators. And so it's a white supremacist system that you buy. This is Franz Fanon, right? Talking about Black skin and white masks, right? It is the challenge of seeing how it's all part of a colonizing education system. And so you can't really blame the individuals because this is the system that they were brought up in. The other challenge, I think, is we have to recognize we focus probably too much on compositional diversity and not enough on the intellectual challenges, right? So having Black teachers, we celebrate representation. I'm not saying representation is unimportant, but what is being taught is critical. And what we end up having is one of the concepts that I wrote in one of my books is this idea of white echoes or white amplifiers. It's a white dominant ideology that is perpetuated not just by white people, but by Black, Indigenous, and other people of color, right? And this is why Reverend Dr. Cornel West would say that every day he's trying to kill the white supremacist that lives in him, right? And if Dr. Cornel West can say that, I should be able to say that. We should all recognize that. So we have to recognize the system, the educational system and the structures that are in place that is a white dominant ideological system that is embedded in all of us.
Sure. Thank you very much. You know, I think when I think about this, it calls to mind, you know, speaking the King's English. It's like, is that really required? Janine?
All right, next question. I'm a middle-aged white woman raising 3 sons, and after reading Dr. Kendi's book, I realized that being a not racist family was not good enough. What advice can you give me to be successful at ensuring my boys grow up to be men who will fight racism and be allies?
Dr. Murray?
As a parent, I know exactly what the question is asking. And it is very difficult to do what you need to do because the system is pushing back. As all my colleagues have pointed out, the system does not intend to give an inch. And so what we have to do is to begin to expose our children to an enrichment, to other cultures, to history, take them to the library, or you don't really need to go to the library anymore. Just you can Google lots of materials. So that's where I would start. I would start by exposing them to a wealth of knowledge. As a matter of fact, a couple of the colleagues talked about some of those books like The Miseducation of the Negro or Franz Fanon's book. And so please do those kinds of things so that you're young and also with yourself because you don't know either. And so, but recognize that that's the beginning. That's the beginning, and it's not anything that you should be ashamed of, but that you just move forward.
Dr. Hernandez Alexander?
Education, we keep going back to we're educators, so we're always going to go back to education, right? But I think what's important is self-education. One, obviously, there's a plethora of resources now out there that you can go on a self-guided bibliography of how to become more aware. But there's two things that are true, and there's history, right? History is written, it's there. Look for the B-sides of history. With every Eurocentric telling of history, there is what the rest of us were doing on this continent of the America. And so you could simply just go back to factual history. You can also make appeals to loving your neighbor. So when you meet the end of logic, what's the end of logic, right? Maybe faith, maybe love, loving your neighbor, compassion. Then you have to ask, why is it hard for you to understand that? Why does it make you feel a kind of certain way when people exert their power, when people of color exert their power? It's more of a line of questioning that you can go into at your kitchen table that can unearth why racist feelings are what they are, and be able to unearth them by simply asking yourself, why do you think you feel that way?
Thank you. Dr. Faraji.
Well, I think that it's important. I want to echo Dr. Murray as well, to expose our children and our youth to the diversity of cultures and traditions in the United States, but also around the world. And it's fairly easy to do that in Southern California, you know, as opposed to maybe some other places in the country, because the world is here, the globe is here, right? And so I think that is fundamental as well. And of course, this authentic human history I keep talking about, in terms of who are we in relation to one another? Who are we in relation to Africa, Asia, the Americas, and the Pacific Islands and so forth, right? In Europe? This, for me, has to be emphasized and then demonstrated and practiced. You know, today, you know, it's March 17th, it's St. Patrick's Day. And of course, I know the history of St. Patrick and his missions to that island in the British Isles and so forth. You know, and so I turned on some traditional Irish music, because I have a 7-year-old and 5-year-old, right? And I'm playing the music, and I say to them, okay, what culture is this? And so they're used to me playing music from Ghana, Nigeria, South America, Senegal, or whatever. But I played this music, so I kept asking them, what do you think it is? And they didn't know. I said, well, this is Irish traditional music. I just wanted them to understand how vast, how big this world that we live in, sure. And to respect the diversity that human beings come in.
Right.
Respect it and practice love. And love is truth and justice and righteousness and peace and action. That's what love is.
Okay. Thank you. Dr. John.
Homeschool. As a parent of 3 children, 3 teenagers, what I mean by homeschool, I mean what they're learning in school, come home and deconstruct and debrief and say, what are you hearing? That's part of the challenge every day. People do that for a variety of reasons, but I think that's raising criticality. As soon as they come home, they should be able to recognize what may not sit right. The other one is, you know, we need to be careful for ourselves, not only for our children, but for ourselves, that we don't gaze upon the other with some sort of fascination, right? We're not looking, it turns out it's not a window into other people's cultures. It's a mirror that reflects back our own. And so you've got to be the first one to recognize your own ideologies, long held assumptions about truth. And as your children hopefully will see you wrestling with this, they'll see that becomes normal. And so that's sort of part of the challenge. It's not just for them. I think it starts with us.
Yeah, education, absolutely. Exposure, extremely important, and to everything else. And you're right. I mean, for me personally, it was just teaching them to question everything, you know, starting with commercials, like, is that true? And then they look at you the first time and go, I don't know. Well, ask yourself, look at it. You have mind, you know. So I think and keeping that available to children wherever we are. You know, if I can bring that to someone else's child, I will. And so we're going to take one last question. Janine, you have something queued up?
I do. Okay. So how do we, in our work with young people, talk to them and give them the proper tools for handling racial microaggressions?
I hate that term, microaggressions. I just think it's just aggression. But anyway, Dr. Murray, to you.
Oh, that's really a difficult question for me. But at the same time, in thinking about this, every day we're injured over and over again, and our children are injured. And the research that I've looked at shows that overt racism, we deal better with it. As African Americans, we deal better with it. But ambiguous racism is so painful because we're just not quite sure. And it's kind of stays with you and hangs over you and lurks. They need to be made aware of what these things mean and how it can affect them. And so you can teach them about it. When it happens, it's a time for a lesson. It's time to sit down and say, how did that make you feel? And why did it make you feel that way? And what was the purpose? Why did that person do that? Is it something about you or something about that person? And once they can understand it's not about me, it's about the kind of attitudes that that person has and not about me, they can handle it better, much better than thinking it's something about them. Dr. Jung had something that he said that I thought we should elaborate on also, is self-knowledge. Self-knowledge is the root of all knowledge. And I could elaborate forever on that, but I'm gonna close at that point.
Thank you very much, Dr. Murray. Dr. Hernandez Alexander?
I have to completely echo what Dr. Murray said, but I kind of wanted to share a small anecdote. I think that self-awareness of your own children and instilling pride and confidence in who they are is so important. As I navigate with my own Black and Brown children, we experience these aggressions called microaggressions. And I have to share a quick anecdote with you. A sweet little Caucasian friend of his comes over to our house and immediately starts saying, "Why do you guys eat that way? Why do you put your sandwiches like that? How come you eat like this? I've never had a burrito before." And he's just spent his whole day kind of deconstructing our house, saying like, we do things differently. Because when he left, I sat my son down and I said, look, did you see how he was picking apart everything? Oh, he just, his house is different. I said, he's accustomed to being the baseline. He's accustomed to being the norm. And so anything outside of him and the way his house does things is weird. I said, you don't do that at someone else's house, first of all. And second of all, there is nothing wrong with the way we do life in our home. And it's something that hurt me as a child growing up, going to school with my burritos and my tacos when all I wanted was a peanut butter jelly sandwich in my lunchbox. This is something that happens, and it ate away at me as a child. And I am here to protect my children from those little microaggressions that really do eat away at their confidence. And so just seeing it, naming it, and having conversations with your kids about it.
Okay. Dr. Faraji.
Yes, absolutely. Dr. Hernandez, Dr. Murray, Dr. John, I just echo, everything you all said. We want to raise our children in a way that they are impervious to aggression and microaggression, because they are so in love with who they are as human beings, as cosmic beings. For me, as children of African descent, my children, when I think about, I have 4 daughters. My 2 oldest daughters are adults, 29 and 26, and I have a 75-year-old. So you can know I've dealt with the whole politics of black women's hair, right? Black females' hair and so forth in this culture, right? And so how do I make them impervious to that? Well, you have curly, coily, cotton candy hair. My 5-year-old, 7-year-old, I bought him a book. That was the title of the book, Curly, Coily, Cotton Candy Hair. And so just this morning or yesterday, my daughter is looking in the mirror. My hair is beautiful. It's curly, coily, cotton candy hair, right? And so, she sees any microaggressions about, Black girls or Black women's hair. It's like, what are you talking about? You are terribly misinformed and misunderstanding. I'm not the one that have the problem. right? And I know it's difficult to do in a society where we often don't control the imagery, we don't control communications, right? So forth. And so we have to keep reinforcing just self-knowledge and self-love and what I call authentic human history. You know, we've been walking this planet for millions of years before somebody in the 16th, 17th, 15th century came up with a construct called race, right? And I know I've said it 1,000 times tonight, but I think that cannot be overstated.
No.
And so our children have to understand as well.
And Dr. Jim, we'll close out with you.
I have nothing more to add to this wonderful panel of responses, but that won't stop me from saying something. Two thoughts. Combating microaggressions with microaffirmations is what I think I'm hearing, is, you know, how you can reaffirm things that are important in very small ways. The other challenge, if there are young people, helping them with a script, you know, a good answer. So when someone asks me, hey, what are you? You're Korean. Are you from North Korea or South Korea? The answer is always North Korea. Okay, you see, teach your kids how to be a smart mouth. I'm kidding a little bit. I think it's important to help them have the tools rather than leaving it to them to come up with answers. What are some responses that would be helpful? And a job of parents and teachers and older brothers and sisters, I think that's critical to help. It's a Band-Aid. It's a Band-Aid, but it's something. And I think the other piece, and I want to end with this because this was me today. Knowing when to press the pedal, when to hit the brakes, and when to just move away and and rest. It's for your own soul, for your safety. It's death by 1,000 paper cuts. So you've got to know when to step away. If it's social media, if it's interaction with people, knowing to take a break, self-care, I think is critical in this process. And they need to learn that earlier on. Otherwise, they're fighting every single battle, every single time. And that will just lead to racialized trauma. And so I don't know the exact balance, but there has to be some balance.
Well, I just want to say thank you to all of you, best panel ever. And I am going to throw it to Corey so he can close us out this evening.
What a phenomenal discussion. Inland Empire, we can do it here. We have the knowledge, we have the skills, we have the talent to fight racism here. We don't have to bring someone outside the state, from LA, from the Bay Area, to help us with these issues. We can do it here. All we need is to come together and support this movement together. Please go to destroyracism.org, contribute $2, $5, $10 a month to fuel this movement. Y'all know Dr. Kendi wasn't cheap, right? This wasn't free. And we also know you got your stimulus today. Don't act like you don't have it, right? Let's be true anti-racist and put ourselves and our comfortability on the line. So please go today. Also, one of our sponsors, SBX Youth and Family Services, would like to give the first 20 people who go to their website a free book of how to be an anti-racist. First 20 people, go to sbxinc.org. That's sbxinc.org. Before, there was a little problem with sharing the Google form. That has been fixed. Just put in code H104. That's code H104. A special thanks to our host committee, our sponsors, our advisory council members, our phenomenal panelists. We will be back. This is not the only time that we will do this. Thanks to Janice Ruth, Jernine McBride, and those of you who don't even know the person behind the scenes to make sure that this thing went off without a hitch, Jessica Aparicio, who is our Director of External Affairs for SBX Youth and Family Services. She made sure that nothing went wrong, and you know a lot can go wrong with Zoom. We hope that this summit helped you to find your role in this movement. If not, there will be more. Everyone who registered will get regular anti-racist emails and messages on how you can take action. Over 400 of you shared the advisory to stand up for our Asian American and Pacific Islander brothers and sisters. Over 400 of you. That's what it's all about, right? Also, please know that we will have many more actions throughout the Inland Empire. We will not remain silent as the Inland Empire. We will continue to get into what John Lewis called good trouble, necessary trouble, because our children deserve a better future. And it's up to us to give them that better future. We are the answer we've been waiting for. So let's turn the Inland Empire to a no-hate zone. Take that racism somewhere else, because Inland Empire is not going to have it. So be safe, and let's take care of one another. Let's struggle with one another. Let's love one another. And we'll see you the next time. You all have a wonderful night.